So you're all very welcome. My name is James O'Donovan. Myself and Bronwyn Slater, we're the editors of Vegan Sustainability magazine. And I'm going to share the screen now. So this evening's talk is on, in the title of it's Fossil Foods and Future Prospects. So just like, there's a lot of talk about, fossil fuels, and the need to transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources. I think it's helpful also if we think of, foods that come from animals, so beef, so meat, dairy, fish, and so on as fossil foods, because also we need to transition from those. I'm going to just talk a little bit this evening, about environmental stuff. I'm not going to bombard you with too many slides because I've given another talk here at with Sustainable Rights Ireland before. So I'll go ahead and start. Now, if there's any questions, there's just a few of us, so you can ask as we're going along if there's something about a slide that you're not sure about. So the environment is complicated, and one of the models that's used, it's become very popular globally now, are these planetary boundaries. And they've identified 9 planetary boundaries. And currently we're exceeding 6 of them. So biosphere, that's got to do with biodiversity. Land system change is got to do with ecosystems being converted to agriculture, or also deforestation. Freshwater change, agriculture uses 70% of fresh water. And then down the bottom, that's due to fertilizers and also due to slurry being spread on land from agricultural use. And then, of course, climate change. So the main cause of climate change is fossil fuels, the use of fossil fuels, but food system contributes about 1/3 of all emissions. And then novel entities is just the addition of man-made chemicals to the environment and the impact that they're having. So for out of these 6, for agriculture is the main impact on biodiversity, land systems change, freshwater use, and geochemical flows. And it's the second leading cause of climate change. It is also a significant contributor to novel entities. Now, we're just going to talk about 1 or 2 of these just this evening, very briefly, just to show you kind of so you get a sense of the scale of things. So in terms of biodiversity loss, habitat loss or habitat degradation is the largest impact on terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems, and fishing then is the biggest impact on the oceans. So that's from IPBES. They're, the biodiversity equivalent of the IPCC, and that was their major report in 2019. Intergovernmental panel on biodiversity and ecosystem services. It's a bit of a mouthful. So half of ice-free land is used for agriculture. And as you can see here, the vast majority of that is used for grazing. And then the land that's used for crops, 40% of it is used for animal feed. So half of the ice-free land on the planet is used for agriculture. And as soon as ecosystems is converted to agriculture, most of the biodiversity is gone. And agricultural land now, you can see, is the largest ecosystem on the planet. So in Ireland, one of the big selling points is grass-fed beef and dairy, but that basically means biodiversity-fed beef and dairy because it's the destruction of very complex ecosystems to grass monocultures, eliminating all the biodiversity. And that's what's needed to produce this kind of ecosystem, which is just a shot from Google Maps of anywhere in Ireland. If you look on Google Maps satellite image, you'll see this kind of ecosystem. So industrial fishing takes place on also more than half the ocean, and it provides just 1% of our food calories. Now, for some coastal impoverished communities in Africa and the global south, it's very important, but even their sustenance is being undermined by industrial fishing. So, for example, there was a program recently on the Gambia. A fisherman from Kinsale went down to the Gambia to work with the fishermen there, but there was Chinese fishing fleets offshore catching fish and then converting those fish into fish meal and fish oil, and then sending them to Europe for feeding farmed fish off the coasts, farmed salmon, for example, off the coast of Ireland or off the coast of Scotland and Norway. So so industrial fishing is really hoovering up fish in other parts of the oceans. So that's a complicated image, but it's just the top left-hand corner. You can see the fishing effort in green, and where it gets dark blue along the coasts, it obviously is where the most effort is made. And the fishing effort down in the bottom left, you can see that's kind of the productivity of the oceans, so the kind of plankton and the zooplankton and the phytoplankton, they're the basis for the food system in the oceans. And so wherever they're blooming, then you get these, you get the fish that fishing industry are hunting. So different diets, need different amounts of land. So currently we're using 4 billion hectares, over 4 billion hectares. And if you just cut out beef and mutton, it reduces that nearly in half. And then if you cut out dairy, again, there's a big reduction. And if you go vegan, you reduce it the whole way down to a quarter. So that has a massive, that would have potentially a massive benefit for biodiversity. So without meat and dairy consumption, global farmland use could be reduced by more than 75%, and we would still have loads of food. Animal agriculture actually undermines food security. So also there's lots of organizations in Ireland now, like Fair Seas, working for marine protected areas. Ireland has just less than 10% of marine protected areas, and none of them are enforced yet. They've agreed to 30%, but they're only calling for 10%, 1/3 of that, to be no-take zones. But, this was a call from a National Geographic lead researcher, Enric Sala. It's a TED Talk, to turn the high seas into the world's largest nature reserve. So that was one proposal that he was making. So that was talking about kind of land use and also oceans. So then just to talk briefly on climate change. So meat and dairy production there's different figures. One figure that's been fairly consistent is 14.5% of greenhouse gas emissions. But more recent research is showing that the figure is a bit higher. So this is from the EU Joint Research Commission, showing that the total food system, so all the different stages from farming, processing, packaging, transportation, and consumption, produces 34% of global emissions. And that varies from country to country. So in Ireland, it's significantly higher, agriculture, because we have obviously a huge agricultural system. In other countries in the global south that are not industrialized, their agriculture would also be more than 50% of their emissions, but their emissions are much lower than countries like Ireland and other EU countries. So you can't quite see that, but that headline up at the top there shows that 60% of I'll just do that for a moment, just so that meat accounts for nearly 60% of all greenhouse gases from food production. So I wanted you to see that headline. So 60% of that 34% gives you 20%. You know, so that's just approximately. But one of the huge things that is hidden about that is that when you clear in, when green carbon dioxide goes into the atmosphere, it stays there more or less permanently. So when you convert a forest, let's say, to a pasture, then all the carbon that was in those trees and in the soil gets converted to carbon dioxide. So if we could restore ecosystems on agricultural land, then that could sequester up to 22 years of current fossil fuel emissions over the next 30 years, which is a huge, there's no other technology that can achieve that. So there really is huge potential for a dietary transition to have a huge impact on climate change. So this shows the Eat Lancet diet and how much, you know, how much carbon dioxide would be sequestered there. And this shows a vegan diet and how much it would sequester. So it's a huge amount of emissions that would be sequestered. And that's published now on World in Data, which has some fantastic information on the environmental impacts of meat and dairy production and the benefits of a vegan diet. So in terms of food security, we produce way more food calories than we need to, but a huge amount of those food calories are fed to farmed animals. And so we have enough food production to feed another 4.8 billion people. So this shows the numbers, all the numbers that you see on the page are in terms of calories per person per day. So the edible crops grown annually is nearly 6,000 calories per person per day when this research was published, which is more than 2.5 times. So all the WHO assumes about 2,300 calories per person per day. So that's 2.5 times that. Now you can see the black, they're losses in, you know, in harvesting at the different stages. And then the blue is the food calories that's converted to fuel, you know, so they're biofuels. So already 808 calories per person per day for every person on the planet gets converted into fuel. And then about 1,738 calories per person for everyone on the planet is given to farmed animals. And that just produces about 600 calories per person per day of meat, fish, and dairy. And so there's a huge, also you see the brown below the line. So that's all the calories that farmed animals get from grazing, and also, yeah, just from grazing, from silage, from alfalfa, from hay, and stovers is just when they harvest wheat, the leftover stalks. So all of that, all of those calories also, that combined gets converted to 594. So you can see there's huge amount of wasted calories, food calories, going to farmed animals. Sorry. There is significant food calories lost due to food waste. And then also, it also shows that converting food to fuel isn't a good idea because it uses huge areas of land which would otherwise be ecosystems. So there isn't any problem with availability of food right now, but it's just what we're choosing to direct the food towards. So this was another research done in 2013 on croplands that gave a similar research finding. But the research I showed you previously, that's more recent, I think 2018 or 2020. Okay, so then just to summarize that first half of the talk. So a vegan food system reduces ag land by 75% while restores biodiversity and still produces more food. Meat, dairy, and eggs produce a quarter of total EU greenhouse gas emissions, 20% of global, but a quarter in the EU because of our higher rates of consumption. Industrial fishing provides only a tiny amount of food calories, but it's very destructive. And a vegan system would massively increase food security. Now, one remarkable thing is that countries that have very large animal-based food production systems like Ireland and the EU, they become net food calorie consumers. So Ireland and Europe import more food calories than we produce. And also a vegan food system would be a game changer in terms of addressing climate change. It does take time for ecosystems to restore and for the trees and vegetation and so on to grow. So sequestration is slower in the first year. There is the risk of those ecosystems being impacted by fire down the line. But in a country like Ireland, also those ecosystems, when they get restored, they're much wetter than the current land is. So, as we know, we're very far away from a vegan food system. So what kind of are the future prospects? So there is some scientific agreement to eat less meat and more plants, more whole plants. Different scientific organizations from the IPCC, IPBES, the European Commission, and so on, have called for this. Now, the European Commission, you know, there's lots of different contested views there. So this is the Lancet report, and it was recommending that Europeans eat about 80% less meat and dairy products. And it also says that, everybody should be eating a lot more legumes. And it said that the meat and dairy was also optional and could be fully replaced by plant-based protein sources. So that was the Eat Lancet report. This is Project Drawdown, and it just it talks about a very simple solution for climate change: reducing the sources, supporting the sinks, and improving society. So on the left-hand side, you have the sources: food and agriculture. Their estimate is 25% of all emissions. So the EU one now is 34%. But that's food, agriculture, and land use. Yeah, so that's correct. The EU one covers all the sectors of the food system. And they're also saying support the sinks. So they're calling for ecosystems to be restored and then improve society. So on their website, you'll see that a plant-based transition to a plant-based diet is one of the biggest potential impacts on climate change. So then there's a lot of structures locking in unsustainable food systems. So I mentioned briefly there in the Gambia, at times there are people living in poverty and they're fully dependent on, for example, catching fish. So that we're not talking about those systems changing. We're talking about European systems changing. But another big problem is concentration of power. So in Ireland, for example, on RTE, you've got Ear to the Ground on the television, you've got Countrywide on the radio every Saturday morning. And you've got lots of just advertising, whether it's Board Bia's Origin Green or the Dairy Board, relentless advertising, sometimes with misinformation, saying that dairy farming is sequestering carbon and so on. And then you also have banks giving loans at the global level and locally for products that lock in huge emissions moving forward. So you've got institutional lock-ins, like you've got the Department of Agriculture with all of its staff and its multi-billion euro budget, Board BIA and other its organizations, agricultural research groups like Chagask. They're more or less, pushing the same, just continually pushing beef and dairy, basically. And then you've got, some technological lock-ins. So there's lots of barriers to change, but also there's ways around them also. Now, this is an example of subsidies. So you can see there for dairy, so the average income of a dairy farmer last year was 150,000 euros. So each of them still got a check. So that included the subsidy. So, 129, they earned 129,000, got 21,000 more. So the subsidy is just 14% of their income. But for beef farmers, the subsidy was 152% of their income. So their take-home wage at the end of the year was just about 9,000 euro. Cattle other, their take-home wage was about 18,000, and so on. So the average is that the subsidy provides 40% of the income, but obviously there's a very different story really between dairy and tillage, which make quite a bit of money, and then beef and the sheep sector, which make very little money. What we need to do is to stop subsidizing these fossil foods and then move those subsidies to restore nature and biodiversity, and also to support plant-based food companies. So redirecting investments, combating misinformation, also policies, the lobbying of meat and dairy, they have huge lobbying power, and that has big influences on political decision making, both in Ireland and in Europe. So when you look, at kind of trying to change a system, it's important not just to focus on the events that's happening, but also try to see the underlying patterns connecting the events, and also how you can try to challenge these systemic structures. And then again, they're underlain by the belief systems of people. So how to challenge those mental models or belief systems. So this shows meat supply per person. So what you can see is that in Germany, Ireland, Europe, meat supply per person is coming down. But worldwide, it's, for the first time, this is the first time I've seen a dip in worldwide supply of meat per capita. So I think there are early signs, definitely in Europe, there are some clear signs that meat consumption per person is declining. But in other countries, you can see that it is increasing. It's interesting to see, countries like Africa and obviously India are kind of, many countries in Africa have very low levels of meat consumption, and also India does in Asia. So that's just showing what meat consumption per meat supply per person is. And this is showing dairy consumption. So there is also some, this was kind of the financial crisis here. And there also seemed to have been a bit of a drop during COVID times. So there is some gradual decrease in dairy consumption also. In Asia, dairy consumption is much, much less. And also in Africa, it's like Nigeria has over 200 million people, and it's much less. So, so then when you're working to change things, you need to look at behavior, you need to look at these structures, and you need to look at hearts and minds. So there's lots of campaigns like Go Vegan World, which is an educational campaign just trying to wake people up, you know, to I suppose the inherent violence in the fossil food system. And then this is a very, I think, significant and important campaign, and should be starting to kick off in Ireland shortly. I know there was a presentation on this at the Dublin Veg Fest, and UCC Vegan Society is also actively involved in this. And this has also, you know, when the students and that age group are starting to make change, it has a big influence. And veganism is much more prevalent amongst younger age groups and amongst younger women in particular. But this then on the other side, it shows kind of, you know, the strength of the meat and dairy industry. So the European Commission, you know, was calling for some increases to plant-based food system, but at the same time is spending 250 million advertising meat and dairy. And then, you know, the World Bank and other organizations are investing billions into meat and dairy industry around the world. And then that was a meat processing plant, Chinese-funded meat processing plant opening in Banagher. So it's a huge industry with huge economic interests. This is something that was just in The Guardian today. So there was a European Citizens Initiative that lots of you will know about, End the Cage Age. And this was supposed to be, this legislation was supposed to be passed in this term of the European Commission. But then after, you know, fierce lobbying by farmer groups, it's been delayed, you know. So those lobby groups, you know, have direct access to all the politicians and European commissioners in Europe. And, you know, they have huge budgets for derailing, even when 89% of European citizens has supported this, they can still derail things like this. So sometimes even when you have huge public support, still those power structures can obstruct things. So this is an example of a legal challenge being taken by Antashka relating to nitrate pollution, again from animal agriculture. Now there was a similar legislate ruling that affected the Netherlands. So the Netherlands government were wanting to reduce their nitrates. And then there was a big pushback. You can't see that there, but it just says in the Netherlands, pitchforks were defending, you know, so there was huge protests from farmers in the Netherlands, and then a political movement started by farmers, and they now have won 15 seats in the Dáil. So that's one thing that farmers are doing. And then that's the Energy and Farm Diversification Partner event that took place. Now, mostly they're all kinds of farmers, but predominantly also a lot of tillage farmers are looking to diversify, get into horticulture, move into sectors that are more profitable than just providing animal feeds. So there is some change happening there, but nothing significant as from what I've seen so far. So that one didn't show. Another example, let me see that slide, what it was. Okay, that one. So you can see that one, that's what you mentioned there, Dennis. The Danish government invests 100 million into a plant-based fund. So that's a really successful project. They had a whole load of, startups now, plant-based startups accessing that fund. And in Europe now, plant-based dairy makes up 11% of the total milk market. And plant-based packaged meat make up 6%. And they're growing about 10% per year. So there's hundreds of companies, plant-based companies, moving into that sector, and it's also growing rapidly. So one thing I wanted to show was, let me see there, if I can do that. So often you'll hear, how huge the dairy sector is. There's a recent report just on RTE there stating that dairy is contributing 17 billion to the Irish economy. Now, this is from the Central Statistics Office in 2022 and 2021. And it shows that agriculture, forestry, and fishing down here at the end contribute 3.6% to Ireland's GDP annually. Because, of course, when you look at the export value, when you look at the import value, Ireland is exporting about 18 billion. And when you look at the other goods, it looks substantial. But then when you look at all the services together with the goods, then it's not a huge part of our economy. So also all farmers get 2 billion total in direct subsidies, as well as a whole host of other indirect subsidies. And if that 2 billion was invested in other industries, they'd be much more, it would be way more profitable. The other thing that you see on television, the reason I have this slide, is that there's a recent advertisement campaign from Board Bia showing dairy farmers, sequestering carbon. And you have a continual steady stream of reports showing that there's so much being invested in climate mitigation, and we'll reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by so much by this year. And the greenhouse gas emission per unit of milk produced is going down. And even though that is true, the total emissions from dairy is increasing substantially. And what this slide shows, it shows agricultural emissions over the past 32 years. And it has increased over the past 32 years, despite countless reports from the beef and dairy industry saying that, we have technologies to reduce methane, we're doing countless measures, the government publishing ag climatized policies and so forth, and CHAG is producing other endless reports on climate change. And still the emissions are just going to continue going up. So obviously, I think everybody here is working to try to transition to, a vegan food system. So it's far from happening, as we know, but there are some, in my opinion now, there's quite a lot of positive, strong things coming into place, that mean we're going in that direction. And these were just a collection of ideas I pulled together, in order to make progress. It's going to take somehow more coalitions, even with groups, non-vegan groups, for example. There's many non-vegan groups who are calling, for example, for the end to factory farming. So even though the goals of veganism are broader and deeper than that, still you can have a coalition with those groups and campaign on that, and it might have a stronger impact. You know, and also, health, people are getting more aware of the health impacts. At the same time as well, yeah, elect vegan politicians. I think that's very important, because in countries like Germany now and Denmark, especially Germany, I would say, you have their, Minister for Agriculture saying that the future is plant-based foods. So that can be a real positive. It can lead to very progressive policies that really put in place the infrastructure, the business infrastructure needed for the transition. Okay. So there's some thoughts anyway. Anybody? So we have some time for just people's thoughts and comments or questions. Planetary boundaries, similar to tipping points. Like the way planetary boundaries are framed is it's like a safe operating space. And so, like with ecosystems, there isn't, like with complex systems, there isn't just one tipping point. Like I heard Laura Keogh talking about a plane having loads and loads of rivets in it, and bit by bit the rivets are popping out, but eventually there might be a wider system collapse. So for example, off of Newfoundland, the North Sea cod, the cod collapsed there, that population of cod collapsed. And now the ecosystem niche that they were occupying has actually been occupied by another species. So that will alter all the different connections and flow through of nutrients through that ecosystem. So it's rare that all the ecosystems, for example, would collapse over a whole region. But, as systems continue to get degraded now, right now, today, we're living with ecosystems that are greatly degraded, but there's a shifting base point, so we don't notice it so much. But for example, Irish ecosystems are amongst the most degraded ecosystems in the world. They measure that by biodiversity intactness index, and Ireland is one of the lowest in the world for that. Is there a layperson's guide to transitioning subsidies to farmers? How would you assess the take-up for these subsidies? And what kind of alternative food transitioning projects are suggested? Are Irish farmers truly interested in transforming into ecology, biodiversity restoration, etc.? Which potential projects are more attractive to farmers? Is there a lot of resistance? So there are lots of good questions, Linda. So right now, the subsidies are based on land area, basically, as long as the farmer keeps the land in good agricultural environmental condition, which basically just means in grass. And that's the reason why we have the gorse fires every year, because if the farmers don't burn the gorse, they'll have payments deducted. Now, so myself and Bronwyn, we set up this Nature Rising website, and it shows, loads of projects that farmers are already doing from their own initiative. So farmers know that they're price takers. They don't set the price. So, and farmers also know that when they transition more from just primary producers also into processors, they make much more money. So we have examples of farmers, producing flaxseed oil with cold pressed flaxseed oil. Obviously, we know from the canola oil or the rapeseed oil, and that's now being produced in Ireland on a commercial scale. So farmers are already transitioning, but historically, Ireland is a bit of an anomaly because of our colonial past. All our forests were cleared basically, and so much more of our land, our land, is being farmed, let's say, than the European average. Um, so are Irish farmers truly interested in transforming into ecology biodiversity restoration? I don't know, but it seems unlikely. Now there's this new forestry payment scheme which has come out, and that's increased the payments for farmers. But there's been some significant criticism from farmer organizations as well. So they're working with the government to change that. But the average age, there's a big difference between dairy farmers and beef farmers. The average age of a beef farmer is 62. So a lot of them are working a second job, and they're doing beef farming on the side. But you can see that the emissions from agriculture are continuing to rise. So if Ireland wants to meet its climate targets, gradually the pressure on the Irish government to do more in agriculture will increase.
James, thank you very much. Yeah.
Mhm.
Have you a figure for as percentage of what in fish caught? How much of the fish would go to farmed animals as feed?
Oh, it's not so huge.
Yeah.
Like it used to be bigger before, but the cost of fish meal and fish oil now has gone up a lot. And so soy protein is much cheaper. And so, the vast majority of fish meal and fish oil is going towards factory farmed fish like salmon.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And yeah, do we have a percentage of that, or is there a kind of a figure on it?
Like often Greenpeace comes out with a kind of a fish meal. I've seen a Greenpeace fish meal, fish oil report. Um, I could look that up for you, Dennis. I don't have it to hand right now.
Okay, thank you,
Yeah,
James.
yeah. Like, believe it or not, in Ireland, when fishermen or fishers, when they catch sprat or sand eel, which they're going to use for salmon feed, those tons of sprat and sand eels, which are small fish, very important for offshore birds and for other species, they don't even have to measure the quantity they catch. Yeah.
Oh dear. Yeah, and they go then to feed fish farms.
Salmon, yeah. You
Yeah.
see, some countries like China, they farm vegetarian fish like tilapia, and they only need to feed them duckweed and other, plants, and the duckweed grows on the surface of their ponds. But in
Right.
Europe, we farm predominantly salmon, and they're carnivorous fish, so they need other fish.
And in the delivery then of this the sand eels, would that be turned into meal, or are they given whole, or how does it work?
I don't know exactly.
Okay.
I don't know if I think it's just given whole. I don't know if
Yeah.
there is a fish meal, fish oil plant in Ireland. I think most of the fish meal and fish oil is imported into the country.
Okay. Thank you, James. Thank you.
Mhm. Okay. So if there's no other questions,
James, I've got one.
yeah, Roger.
Well, in fact, I've got a few now that you've been talking, because I always find your talks really educational and really fascinating. So thanks very much for that. First of
Yeah.
all, I've been looking at your mag actually online when we're doing this, which is quite interesting. Do you have like a subscription, or do you?
We just send it around. People can subscribe with their email address, and then we send an email 4 times a year. Yeah, and so that's what we do. And then you can access any of the articles online.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot in the mag which reminded me of an organization called Movement for Compassionate Living. And I wondered whether you're familiar with that.
I'm not actually.
Okay, well, I think it might still be operational and it might be based in Swansea, but it was essentially an offshoot from the Vegan Society.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you know Kathleen Janaway's work, she found
I know Paul Appleby. I don't know that woman's work, but I see that their website is still active anyway, that Movement for Compassionate Living. I'll definitely check that out.
yeah, it might be quite interesting. It's interesting what you were saying about the subsidies. You know, Declan Bowens always calls it farmer's dole,
Yeah.
which the farmers don't like, of course. But
Yes.
and it was interesting that distinction between beef and dairy that you made.
Yeah.
There is a dairy farmer who goes live on TikTok, and he's quite interesting in the sense that you can ask him questions as a vegan and he doesn't block you. A lot of farmers do block you as
Yeah.
soon as the vegan asks them a question. And so I asked him about subsidies. You know, if you were subsidized to transition, would you be interested? And he said no.
Yeah.
But quite a lot of farmers who used to come up to us in Westmoreland Street in Dublin, they were interested because they were kind of wanting to get out of the business. You know,
Like, yeah, my feeling as well is farmers know the climate is changing, and farmers care about the future of their kids and their grandkids. And, like one of the things that I found out recently, I was talking to a tillage farmer, and like one of the things that happened with the trade is that the European Union used to have a whole load of import tariffs. So if there was any agricultural commodities coming from overseas, the EU used to slap a big tariff on those commodities, and then they would be more expensive than the commodities produced in Europe. So, but then European goods, like, industrial goods, they wanted to export them to all those other countries, but those other countries had tariffs on the European goods. So they negotiated and got rid of those tariffs on both sides. So the protective tariffs, on beef and dairy, but also on products like sugar and fruit and vegetables were eliminated. So, for example, Ireland had 2 sugar factories and had, many, many farmers growing sugar beet for those factories. But then the price per ton on the global market from Brazil sugar was cheaper than any sugar that could be produced in Europe. So there was huge protests by the farmers in Ireland protesting the closing down of that factory. But because the value of the other EU goods is so big, they nobody listened to them. So the farmers are also very much restricted by the cap system, and if farmers had greater freedom, and like the remarkable thing about the subsidies in Ireland for beef farmers is that you could actually guarantee that the beef farmers at least would have no reduction in their income in such a transition, because when the subsidy is more than 100% of their income, then if they stopped their farming, their income would actually go up. And beef and sheep farming is 70% of the land in Ireland. There's about 17,000 dairy farmers, but there's a lot more beef and sheep farmers. But the thing is, of course, the dairy industry, it was very profitable last year, a lot of it because of Ukraine war, so the price of vegetable oil became very high because of the exports from Ukraine going down. So then they were able to sell much more dairy fat and so on. So the commodity prices, they have a big effect. But I do think that there's a lot of farmers, who want to do more for nature. They do that themselves, often at an economic loss to themselves now. But now some of the Department of Agricultural policies have changed a little bit, so that if a farmer now allows for some ecosystems on their land, they're not deducted now. So that's a big step forward. But I think in the long run, I think that like the subsidies, if the subsidies go completely from the dairy farmers, they're going to continue anyway. It would have to be other restrictions on them because it's so profitable for them at the moment. So there will be more pressure on them for their greenhouse gas emissions and also their nitrate emissions.
Well, I don't want to hog all your time, if vegans are allowed to say hog all your time, but I got a couple more. Well, I mean, I think subsidies is a little bit like economics. I don't think many people understand it really, but in relation to other things, what is your take on the viability, sustainability of something like hemp, and also what about vertical farming?
There's a farmer, in North Cork, in Kildinan now, on 5 hectares, growing salad greens. And on those 5 hectares, he's making 90,000 euros a year profit. Just on salad greens, just on 5 hectares. Now, Ireland imports hundreds of millions of euros worth of salad greens. You can see that Kildinan farm in lots of super value shops. So there are loads of things that farmers could do to be profitable. Now, hemp, obviously you've got hemp seed oil, you've got you've got the seed themselves, and you've got the fiber. So there was a report done by Chagask into the viability of hemp, and it didn't come out with a favorable result because it was saying the price of hemp on international markets was too low. But when you can find high-end uses for the hemp product, then definitely it could be viable. Like there has been there was the Irish Farmers Association. They have been promoting hemp also, and there's a number of farmers. There's a farmer in Wicklow growing hemp. There's a number of farmers growing hemp around the country. So lots of other farmers are watching to see that the machinery that you need to harvest the hemp, because the fiber is so strong, it's also another difficulty that they have. Having the processing equipment for a new product takes some substantial investment. But the government is very willing and good at supplying those investments if the demand is there.
Yeah, I never thought about the complication of harvesting hemp, because obviously it is very strong. That's one of its selling points, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So that was one of the things, yeah.
And are you saying that this salad green point that you made, that's vertical farming then, is it?
That's like he's actually just farming in his fields, and he's farming under glass. So like vertical farming, there's a guy has a small rooftop farm here in Cork City, in the Cold Quay where the market is, and he's got a garden center on the ground floor, and then he's got a vertical farm up on the top floor. So vertical farming produces, like high value salad crops and so forth that have a high value. So it's a viable small business for people. I think most of our crops long term, there's a lot of like the infrastructure needed to grow those crops, the materials and energy needed, I think is very high. So I think the most ecologically friendly way to grow things is outdoors in soil. So I'm sure you've seen videos of the stock-free organic farmer in the UK. What's his name again? He calls himself stock-free organic farming, but he's got a fantastic model that he's been doing for 20 years, no animal inputs whatsoever. He
calls
grows
it veganic, doesn't he? Veganic, I think.
He calls his own system stock-free organic.
Oh.
There's also now a veganic certification, just like you have an organic a certification. So there's farmers, there's farmers doing that as well. So his name is let's see, what's his name? I forget his name now. So, you know, so there's lots of possibilities anyway, of stock-free organic, you know, so yeah, so like, so the vertical farming, I think there's room for it, but it does have some downsides.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for that. Thanks,
Yeah.
James.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, how are you for time, James?
I'm good. You know, if there's a question, somebody can ask, and then if not, we can make ourselves a cup of tea.
Well, I have to say that this was a fantastic talk, and there's so many great slides in there. There's so much information, as well as doing the editing and the recording. And thank you, Peter, in advance. I think we might try and take some of the slides out and do a presentation for the website.
Sure.
With the what Linda referred to, the layman's talk, just kind of put it in a synopsis form.
Yeah.
For quick reference, I mean the amount of time people or the patience they have when they're online, it's not, you know, it's not like
Oh,
somebody
it's very limited. Yeah.
so kind of quick hit, just something succinct, and
Yeah.
for the website.
Have a look at the vegan sustainability website. You know,
Yes,
because if you want to look at kind of, if you just want to read a kind of a article size summary of lots of different topics, you can find lots of them in there. And if you want to use any of that content, I think that's quite fine, Dennis.
Well, thank you very much. That's very generous, James. We did put up the one that you do with Bronwyn, the Irish Vegan.ie, with Bronwyn's permission, and we featured
Exactly. That's Bronwyn's own website, actually, the Irish Vegan.
Yes.
So herself and myself, we cooperate on this Nature Rising one.
Nature Rising. Okay.
And that has loads of case studies of farmers doing great stuff around the country, including actually, there's quite a bit in there on hemp. Those case studies I mentioned on hemp are in there, Roger. I can put that link in the chat box there just so that you can have a look at that.
Okay, and we'll put them up and try and get something out on that, and to get the message out. If the visitors that come there.
There is loads of there is loads of ways for farmers to make a good living in Ireland. So in that Nature Rising link that I've just put in there, like when you go to that website, on the right-hand side, there's plant-based agriculture, and that's got a section on hemp there. Yes, and it's got loads of other sections as well.
Yeah, I think that should be our approach for change to be meaningful and effective. We have to let the farmers know that we're friendly towards them. They are the custodians of the land.
Very important point.
Yeah, and that's where the grassroots, change will come from within the food system. So I think that has to be incorporated into our overall plan as well.
Yeah, 100%.
To try and get to gentle farming and work with that. That should be our aim too, and not to alienate. So thanks very much, James.
Great, Dennis. Thanks again, and thanks for your work as well.
Thank you.
Great to see everybody. Yeah, keep well, all.
I really enjoyed that talk.
I'm glad, Dennis. Keep well. Good night, everyone. Take care.